welcome everyone to, I think this is now our third session of this year's Data Week. Today we're hearing from Dr. Nina DeCara on mood music. What can we learn about well-being from our music listening? So I'm going to hand over to Nina DeCara. Over to you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me today. I am really looking forward to talking about this project with you. It's something I've been working on for quite a few years now, and it's started off as a bit of a passion project and it's become more interesting over time, which has been brilliant. So yeah, thank you very much for coming. My name's Nina, and yeah, I'm based at the University of Bristol as well. I'm in psychological science, and I've also been in the medical school previously, which is where I was when I started this project. So we're going to talk about using music listening data for understanding well-being. And this is not a new idea by any means. So using our social media data, the data that we create when we interact with technology over our lives is quite a well-established field of research. It's called digital footprints in general, or smart data is like one of the newer terms that's being used. And it's got quite a history now of different types of devices, different types of media sources being used for understanding different types of mental health, and also loads of other health conditions as well. So, for example, Twitter being used quite often for understanding mental illness and the longitudinal course of our mental health. You can use things like GPS data. GPS data has been pretty popular, in fact, for looking at depression, and more movement generally is associated with lower rates of depression. Looking at smartwatches, so we can use health data from our smartwatches, Apple Watches or Garmin's, to better understand things like our heart rate and stress, and also things like just generally our smartphone sensors. So even how much you move your phone around, the accelerometer in your phone is used for this kind of research as well. So there's lots of very cool stuff. This one I just find amazing. Smart clothing, who would have thought? So just to illustrate, this is one of like a very big picture of different types of data that's being used to understand mental health and well-being in lots of different areas. Looking at all of that, and my background was using this during my PhD, we were looking at Twitter, and I was looking at that with Claire Howarth and Oliver Davis, who are based in the psychological science and the medical school, respectively. And I was here doing my PhD on that, and I was thinking about the different challenges that we face with some of these data sources, and social media in particular is relying a lot on things like how often we post and what we say when we post. But a lot of people don't post that often, and there is a bit of an issue in terms of the amount of data that we can get from those. So even if you're on Twitter or X a lot, you might not be producing a lot of data that can be used for this kind of technology. And actually, when I think about it, if you wanted to know how I was feeling based on the kind of things that I interact with a lot, you probably just have to look at my recently played list on Spotify, and that would give you a pretty good clue. And I figured that I'm probably not alone in that. A lot of people traditionally use music to express themselves or think about how they're feeling, and I thought that might be something that would be really interesting to explore with Spotify. Spotify is a really great kind of resource for this because it has an API that we can use and interact with, and I'll say more about that later. But the availability of music data that we have these days, so this probably wouldn't have been possible at all 10, 15 years ago when we were all using iPods to collect our music, and before then Walkmans, CDs, records. The new prevalence of music streaming, whilst some people aren't super keen on it, and I can understand lots of different issues with music streaming, but it does give us access to these new sources of data, which is super interesting. So we started the study in about 2020 and wanted to ask some kind of established basic questions really for starting this off, which is, firstly, what are the ethical and practical issues that we might run into if we're trying to use music streaming data for this kind of research? And then also, does it even work? It might be that we make this assumption that music is related to our well-being, but maybe actually it has nothing to do with it at all. So exploring those two questions we did with some funding that we got from the JGI. We got seed corn funding to do this. And if you are a Bristol-based researcher, that is an amazing resource, and you should definitely look into it if you're trying to do some new exploratory research. So the first question, which is more about ethics and more about what kind of things this might actually be useful for and when, we explored with a PPI group. So we had 6 participants and we had 5 meetings. And over those 5 meetings, we talked about quite a few different things. So we talked about how they use Spotify, what kind of things they think it's acceptable to collect data for, and whether Spotify is considered particularly sensitive or not compared to other types of data that researchers collect. So For example, is it more sensitive than your banking data or less sensitive than your Facebook homepage? Those sorts of things. We asked for them feedback on the study and their help with designing the software that people are going to be interacting with, and also then asking about what could we actually use this for? What would be useful downstream uses for this sort of technology if we were to make it? And our participants were students and they were regular Spotify users. And our pilot study in general focused on students because A, they're very accessible and they're around, so it's easy to get a group of people to participate in the study for collecting pilot data. But also they're the perfect age group because being about 20, they tend to be the people that are using music streaming services the most. And so just to give you a highlight, this is what we talked about with the participant group, and this is the kind of things we found. So in general, people considered Spotify music streaming data less sensitive than their other social media data. And part of that was because there isn't text in it, and it's the text that people seem to find quite revealing about themselves and they feel less comfortable with sharing. But also the reputation of who's collecting it obviously matters, and that's consistent across all sorts of data. And we know that from lots of other research about people collecting data is the person who has it obviously matters in terms of the trust of participants. It's much more acceptable to use this kind of data for population level analysis. And there are two kind of streams you can go with digital footprints data. So if we were collecting, for example, lots of different types of data and trying to create an individualized model that said, actually, for you as one person, you can have an app that collects all your different sensor data and combines it to say, this is our rough approximation of what your mental health has been doing over the past couple of weeks or months. That's one type of application. Another type of application is looking at, as a group of people, how are their mental health or well-being markers changing over time? And can we link that up with things that are happening in communities or within the world at certain time points and see if that's changing? And those two different uses have very different ethical implications and very different practical use case implications in terms of how we get the data and what we use it for. So population level was generally more acceptable, and that's fairly normal for data analysis stuff. So we just have different questions to ask those two different use cases. And in terms of what people actually use music for, traveling, exercise, cooking, alongside studying, which probably isn't a surprise to anyone, is what you generally expect people to be using it for. But when we talk about whether we use music to change our mood or to match our mood, we get kind of an interesting result, which is that people use it for both, and it really depends on the situation and how someone's feeling. So for example, someone described that they might listen to music in their first language if they felt homesick or from their home country, and that they want that for kind of nostalgia and to kind of sit with that feeling for a while. Alternatively, if you're waking up in the morning and you wanted to get up and go, you might listen to some energetic music to get you started and to kind of wake you up a bit. And so when we're talking about whether we use music in one way or another, I think we're getting into some really complicated causal questions that's probably just a feedback loop between the two, and probably very difficult to untangle, even with really high resolution data. So based on that feedback that we had from the participants, we set up a pilot study in 2021. And what we asked for in the pilot study was, firstly, people's personal Spotify data requests. Now, because of GDPR, most people are able to request their data from any service. And there's actually going to be, I think, a really great talk about data donation, which is kind of what this is called, where you request your data and donate it to a research study later in Data Week. So have a look on the schedule if you're interested to find out more about data donation, how it's being used in research. But this is just one example where you can basically say to Spotify, if you go to privacy, scroll all the way down to the bottom, click request my data, you can get a massive file which has all of your listening history for the past year. If you get the extended one, you can get it even since the creation of your account. And you also get loads of other information about what playlists you've got, which songs you've saved, all that kind of stuff. So we specifically wanted streaming histories from people. We also asked them to do a questionnaire, which was just the kind of stuff that you would normally collect, which is people's demographics. We collected the outcomes we were interested in, which were a scale for depression, for anxiety, and for general well-being, some stuff about personality, and also some music listening preferences. So this project and the pilot was done as part of some dissertation projects, and a lot of the music listening preferences were questions that were thought up by the students as part of their dissertation projects as well. So I'm going to show you a little overview of the data that we got and what we found out doing this part of the project. There we go. So in total, we had 98 participants for this one. And as I said, they're all students, so they were about 20 years old and kind of ranged from 18 to 22. The majority of the sample was female, largely because of where we recruited from. So the School of Psychology or Psychological Science tends to have more female students, so that reflects in the data that we got. And so this first graph is the overview of what I was saying about those music listening preferences. And these are the questions that we pose to people as part of that. And there are a few interesting kind of things that things that I find interesting from these results anyway. Someone else might find something else. One of the things I thought was really cool was that we asked people to say, how likely is it that you stick to a particular genre when you're listening to music? And across the graph, the green is strongly agree on the right, blue is slightly agree. So the blue and the green together is kind of general agreement. The orange and the red together is general disagreement, and then the purple is neutral. And people don't seem to think they stick to a particular genre, which I think if you ask most people that seems to be logical, it makes sense. But it's good to see that actually that is represented when we ask people in this environment. Some other things were interesting about people paying attention to the lyrics, and most people did feel that they do pay attention to the lyrics when they're listening to music, and that they often use music as a background thing, so something that they listen to in the background rather than just sitting down to listen to music, which again makes sense. The ones that I was particularly interested in when we collected this data was the two questions about whether they think music reflects or changes the mood that they're in. So again, trying to get into this thing of like, how do we use music? Is it matching our mood or is it changing our mood? And most people agreed to both of them. So again, I think that's interesting in terms of suggesting that most of us use it for both, and it just depends on the situation. Which doesn't mean that there shouldn't be an association between the two, but means that working out the causal direction for them would be challenging. We had then information about how much music people listen to. And this is a histogram of how the average amount of music listened to by each person in a day. So majority of people you can see are definitely under 5 hours, and most people sitting between this mark of kind of the lowest being 20 minutes and 2.5 hours. There's a big peak there. And so for most people, 1 to 2 hours of music a day is pretty normal, and that makes sense in terms of doing it alongside activities like commuting, studying, or maybe going to the gym and things like that. Some people, I'd love to know the 12 hours, and it is possible, you can leave things on overnight. That would easily rack up 8 hours of music a day if you were doing that, or just having something on constantly in the background. I kind of just wanted to see this, so I thought you guys might find it interesting too, is who are people listening to, and how many people are listening to them? When we say music is popular, what does that actually mean in terms of how many people that is spread across? And so this just shows you very briefly a percentage of how many participants listened to each artist. And so Billie Eilish was absolute top, 80% or 81.6% of all the participants had listened to Billie Eilish at least once in the previous year of their data. Weirdly, not weirdly, but interestingly, Fleetwood Mac and the Beatles are up there after Billie Eilish, above all other popular kind of music and people that you would probably expect to be in this list. Still, Fleetwood Mac and the Beatles are up there. Most people have listened to them at least once, which is interesting to know. So having all that data, which looks like this when you get it, so on the left is a little screenshot. You get the time that someone listened to it, you get the name of the artist, you get the name of the track, and you get the milliseconds. When you request your data from Spotify, this is essentially what you get from them. But we can use the artist name and the track name to search the Spotify API to get much more interesting data about each of the songs, and then use them for modeling in terms of associating with the different outcomes that we collected, which were the depression, anxiety, and well-being. So we've done this as part of this research project, made a Python package that you can use to search your own Spotify data. So if you want to try it, you can go on, you can request your own data, and you can use the Spotify rehydrator to get all of the features of the music and analyze it yourself if you're interested in doing that. And that is essentially what we did. We've used that package to request the information from every single song that is available in all of the listening histories of the 98 participants that we have. Not all of them come back. I think between 5 and 10% per person come back as errors for various reasons, and that's something we're developing and working on improving with the rehydrator if there's another option or different ways to search to get more reliable results. But in general, you get most of them back, which is very interesting. And with that, this is the kind of data that you're getting. So all of these features are ones that Spotify provide through their API. They've created them. They describe what they are. They tell you what they represent. They don't give you a lot of information about how they created them. And this is one of the really tricky things about doing digital footprint research is you're often relying very heavily on data providers who are usually commercial companies like X or Facebook or Spotify to give you the data that they see fit to give you. And they can change that and they can edit it and you might not even really realize. So that's one of the big challenges of doing this kind of research. But very kindly, they have given it to us. And it's the kind of data that is used in recommender algorithms as well when they're suggesting new songs to you or creating playlists and suggested playlists for you. So things like acousticness is how acoustic a track is. Instrumentalness is, how much vocal is in the track or not. So rap versus a piece of classical music. Whether there's an audience, is it a live recording? How much energy is in a track? The loudness, valence. Valence being how positive something is or how negative something is. I'd really love to know how they created that one, but sadly I don't. And you can also get lots of other kind of classical music features like key, mode, so whether it's major or minor, and the tempo, so how fast the piece of music is. And all of those together are really, really valuable to have to then start thinking about what do we think might be associated with different mental health outcomes and what can we actually find from using this data. So I will show you what we have found using this data. Don't worry, it's a big table. We're going to talk through it. So each of the three main columns, you can see it says depression, anxiety, and general well-being. And on the left is a series of those outcomes that we were just looking at. There's also some other derived ones that I've put in. So skipped songs is how many songs you listen to for less than 30 seconds before you skip it. Tracks listened to is like the total number of tracks that you've listened to. And percentage listened to is the average percentage of a song that you listen to in full. So not everyone listens to a whole song. Most of the time we might skip at the end or we might go halfway through. So skip songs are classified by Spotify as less than 30 seconds, but percentage listened to is just the overall percentage of the song that you listen to. And so when we're looking at this, these are all multiple regression models. So we put all of these variables in against the three outcomes on the top and see which variables are coming out as being more important, less important, and so-called statistically significant. But basically when there's a p-value less than 0.05, if you adjust for the three models, then it's 0.016. But basically that's telling us what is the likelihood that this finding is not by chance? What's the likelihood that actually this is a genuine finding and not likely to be happening by accident? So firstly, valence comes up as potentially being important for depression and anxiety, not general well-being. Tempo, again, for depression, so how fast a song is. And valence being like how positive or negative a song is in general. Speechiness is really interesting, and that comes up as well. As you can see in this column here, all of these variables are standardized, so they're all on the same scale, which means you can roughly look at these numbers and see which are overall the biggest numbers, regardless of positive and negative, and that suggests that they might be more important than if they're bigger numbers than the others. So speechiness has the biggest beta value, which might mean that it's pretty important, and it also has a pretty small p-value, so there's some kind of signal coming across from speechiness, which is worth looking into. How instrumental a song is, and there's a whole thing we could talk about the difference between speechiness and instrumentalness. They are different things, even though for quite some time I was convinced that they sounded like exactly the same thing. And also the number of tracks you listen to, which might be a proxy for just how much time you spend listening to music. And the percentage of a song you listen to without skipping it. So if you listen to less of a song, then your depression values are higher. And again, if you listen to relatively less of songs in general, then your anxiety levels are higher. And the same goes for all of these. So as valence is lower, depression and anxiety get higher. slower tempos, again, higher depression scale scores, less speechiness and less instrumentalness, and the more tracks you listen to, high scores. So having a look at all of that, we can kind of pick out some variables which we might be interested in looking at over time. And as I said before, one of the things that we can look at when we're thinking about digital footprints is, can we use these values to see if things happen in response to events, if there are general reactions to certain things that are happening, and do people's well-being change in response to those things? So this is a graph that we made as part of a project. We were looking at COVID-19 and what was happening to people's well-being through COVID-19 pandemic. And interestingly, this data that we collected for the pilot study was in 2021, and it pretty much included the whole last year of their data. So it did actually cover the first lockdown and what's happening during the subsequent couple of lockdowns as well. So for this, we picked out three of the more interesting music features, which were instrumentalness, speechiness, and valence. And you can see that there are some things happening here. We don't have, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, what we don't have is the exact readings of what was happening to their mental health throughout this time, to see whether there's a relationship between the mental health and the Spotify features. But knowing that these features were things that were related at a single time point, we can look and just see how they change through time. So immediately after the first UK lockdown happened, there was quite a dramatic dip in speechiness and valence in particular, which kind of seemed to improve then over a bit of time, stabilize as things started to open again and get normal again, and then went down again around the second lockdown and on the third lockdown. I thought that was very interesting, that there was this relationship between those things happening. Even without the ground truth to look at, it seems to be giving some kind of signals that these things are changing in response to events that are happening, which indicates they might be quite useful in terms of looking at longitudinal changes. So having that, and having said what I said about having ground truth data to measure these sorts of things, the one problem with what we did there in the pilot study is that we were measuring mood at one time point, and we were measuring the music listening at basically a single time point and seeing how they were related, which means we have this information and we can just look at the relationship between those two things at that time. In reality, there's a much more complex interplay going on, most likely, and we can't really measure that until we measure all these other time points too. And so this year, we've been able to set up our second round of this study, where we had 171 participants giving us longitudinal data about their music and their listening. And I'm going to warn you now that I don't have the results to share with you yet, which we're hoping to have out after the summer, but I'm going to tell you a bit about what we collected and what's available and what we're going to be doing with the data. So again, we did this personal account data request. We asked people to get their data and donate it to us. And our sample again was students. And we got them to do the surveys. We got them to do them at 2 time points, at the beginning and at the end of a 2-week period. What we also then did was get them to complete a short mood survey 4 times a week, 4 times a day for those 2 weeks. So what we have is their daily surveys 4 times a day for every single person over a 2-week period, and their music listening data over that period of time. It's surprisingly difficult, actually, to get a short mood survey that you can ask someone several times a day. And this is a method that's called ecological momentary assessment or experience sampling, and some of you may have used it before or heard about it. And it's essentially getting people to record data in amongst their daily lives and respond to research surveys in the immediate moment that things are happening, rather than ask them to recall what was happening. So if I asked you how you'd been feeling at different time points over the last 2 weeks, there's no way you could answer. But by asking people in the moment when it's happening, we can record that data and then use it later. So we developed with the participants in the PPI group this short survey, because a lot of the surveys for measuring mental health and well-being that we use typically are designed to be used in the kind of how have you felt for the last 2 weeks. And a lot of them are also very long. And if I asked you to complete a 30-item survey 4 times a day for 2 weeks, I think no one would ever do the research, and it probably wouldn't be very useful. So one of the things we did was develop this survey, and it's measuring well-being across a few different factors. So based on a model where we start from being activated and deactivated, which is kind of about energy, and pleasantness and unpleasantness, which is on the other axis. And you can see how this works by looking at things like cheerful is activated, so there's quite a lot of energy and cheerfulness, and it's also pleasant. But being relaxed is deactivated because it's kind of associated with less energy and being kind of calmer, but it is a pleasant type of deactivated, whereas sadness is a unpleasant type of deactivated. So you can see that we've got 4 things across those different kind of quadrants of that. And then also worried, because the participant group really felt strongly that worry was an important factor in how we use music to moderate our mood and our feelings. One of the things we were able to do with the pilot study was check that that survey was actually measuring the things that we wanted to. And we did that against something called the positive and negative affect schedule, which is like a very well-established survey for measuring this, but again, has something going on 30 questions. So not something that would be suitable to ask people frequently. And we were able to see that, yes, positive affect was associated with the positive, pleasant questions that we asked, and negative with the negative questions that we asked, which is good. And overall, using that really short survey, we were able to explain 44% of the kind of variance of information that's in the positive affect schedule, part of the schedule, and 40% of what's in the negative affect part of the schedule, which is great considering it's only that short amount. And because we have it so many times, we can also kind of bolster the amount of information that we have. So what this is going to allow us to do, and we are working on this now, which is really exciting, we're collecting all the data, doing all the API calls to collect all the music listening data too, is measure mood and music at these time points and actually start to understand what is changing as we look at the 2 time series together. So that was just a very kind of overview run through of what we've been doing with this project, what we found so far. I think it's really exciting that we found some results even with the pilot study data in a relatively small sample, that hopefully now we've got a bigger sample, we're going to be able to see if they replicate or if something changes because of the longitudinal data and the longitudinal associations actually being different. There were some weird results in terms of white noise, which I thought was interesting because white noise came up, and particularly rain sounds, came up really high in energy. If you remember the Spotify API, one of the features you can request is the energy of a piece of music. And a lot of people listen to rain sounds, presumably when they're falling asleep or if they want to relax, pink noise or studying as well. Pink noise, brown noise, all those different types of ones. And rain noise is very popular. And it's basically 1 for energy. So really, really high energy. And if I was thinking about tracks that had a lot of energy in them, I definitely wouldn't have chosen rain noise as being one of them. I would associate that much more with people trying to relax. And so I think there might be something interesting to explore about what's happening listening to those sorts of those sorts of lo-fi sounds and rain noise sounds, and whether energy we can like split that out and make it a bit more of a useful variable. Also lyrics, a lot of people said they listen to the lyrics, and there's a few more APIs coming out now where you can request song lyrics, and whether if we include those and do some sentiment analysis, are the lyrics positive, are they negative, is there a lot of swear words in them, that sort of thing. We could do something similar to what we've been doing with social media data and looking at how language is related to well-being as well, and the language of the music that we listen to. So that might be interesting next steps as well. And I'd also be really interested to hear if anyone has any kind of questions that they have about music and how it's related to mood that we might be able to try and explore with this data set. Good to know is that we're hoping to make the data sets open, both the pilot study and the main study, so keep an eye out. I'm on Twitter at Nina Dakara. If you want to follow me, I'll probably talk about it if we do release them. But yeah, keep an eye out. Hopefully we'll be releasing results for that one later this year and information about the data sets. And thanks to the research team that we're also doing this together is Professor Claire Howarth and Oliver Davis as well, and Annabelle King, who was the research assistant that helped collect all of this year's study data, which was a mammoth task. So there we go. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Nina. That was absolutely fascinating, and I can't wait to hear about what you find. We'll have to have you on next week's Data Week to tell us your findings. So we've got about 15 minutes. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat box. I noticed somebody, while you were speaking, said, so for the artists listened to, graph. If the participants listened to Spotify curated playlists or allowed Spotify to suggest songs regularly, this could reflect the prominence of particular artists placed on those playlists because they're being pushed by Spotify. So I suppose that's the kind of a thing that it comes into play.
Yeah, that's really, I think that's really true of like the difficulty with using a lot of this data for digital footprints research and health research is that it's totally unknown to us how much of what we're getting is influenced by the kind of commercial algorithms that are being used to suggest that content. And the same thing happens with social media, for example. Like we don't know, and there have been some great studies about what happens when you change people's news feeds and how that impacts their mental health. Without knowing how people are producing that information, it's really hard to know what impact it has on the data.
Yeah,
But it's a really good point.
the black box behind it. So yeah, we have one question. So I said, thanks, it's from Chris. Thanks for the interesting talk. How was loudness measured? dB is a unit of sound pressure level. Recorded music is compressed and additional compression occurs in the earphones due to mechanical considerations. So the dynamic range of recorded reproduced music track that might be perceived as loud in a live setting is likely to be less than that of a quieter track.
I tell you what, Chris, I'm going to try and find right now the Spotify's definition for how it was measured because it's literally it's an interesting question because you really don't know very much about what you're getting and how exactly they've decided to measure it outside of the very short description that they give you. So yeah, I can try and find it in a second. I'll post it in the chat if I do.
Is there any other questions? Or any kind of in things you're interested in how the project could be taken? Oh, so Theo says, I tried a similar experiment using my own Spotify Echo Nest data and Met Office weather data, although found that it was hard to access this at a granular level. Have you tried to correlate environmental data, setting and weather with your data, e.g. GPS and weather?
No, but that's a super interesting question. Hopefully, well, the benefit of that kind of data, I guess, is a lot of it's open, so you can match it and link it post hoc, even if it was not a question that we kind of collected the data for at the time. So if we can go back and use the open APIs that a lot of those organizations said, like the Met Office, tend to have pretty good data. And also, if we make it open, it's the kind of thing that we could, it would be very open for other people to try and explore with this data is the hope. Because everyone was in Bristol, they're all Bristol-based people, I guess you could make an assumption that they were experiencing relatively similar weather at the same time. So that would be a really interesting one.
Yeah, because definitely when it's dreary outside, that 100% affects.
Everyone have their speakers on as well out in the park when it's sunny.
I've got a couple more. So do you think Spotify are doing this sort of analysis behind the scenes?
Yes, definitely. I'm pretty sure they are. And I know that they are because they actually published a paper about personality and music choices, I think in 2021. So that's definitely something that they're interested in. Ethically, that's a really interesting area for me because I feel very conflicted about how we do open data and open science in these ways when data is potentially useful to commercial entities and whether I can license. I've been exploring with the open data team if I can license the data set so it can't be used for commercial use, it can only be used for research in health and wellbeing things. Because yeah, that's a tricky one to kind of straddle both of those things.
Yeah.
They definitely are. Yeah.
And then Christian said, is there any commonality between Spotify and Apple Music for APIs? He's asking because they surf between the two depending on price deals.
Yeah, that's interesting. API wise, I need to look into Apple Music's more, but Spotify had a lot more information available, and whether you could even use Spotify's API for the data using the Apple Music, you probably could. Also interesting whether there is a difference between Spotify and Apple Music users. Like you're saying, if you go between the two, but some people, I don't know, is it that people of a certain demographic prefer Apple Music to Spotify, which would massively bias the kind of results that we're getting as
Yeah.
well.
So Sarah has said, I wonder if there's a difference in Spotify premium members and that those that use free Spotify, and whether you use the data for both. So again, I suppose it's the demographic-y kind of thing.
Yeah, we've collected it. We collected whether it was free or premium, partly because free forces you to listen to certain songs in a certain order, so you don't actually have as much choice over what you're doing. And that's one of the things to look at next. But most of our users were premium, so the class imbalance was massive between the free and the premium users, which is slightly less useful.
Yeah, yeah. Pete says, I was wondering if is there any mileage in looking at specifics of how people use Spotify with exercise and how this links in with well-being. So use it for running. He personally use it for running.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, if you look at music, kind of music psychology and also exercise science, there's a ton of stuff about music and how music is used for people, to kind of motivate them for exercise and also help people train and that kind of stuff. So there's definitely a link up to be had there about how people use music, but maybe using new sources like Spotify. Part of it is also creating all of these resources around the study. So like having the Spotify Rehydrator app, hopefully that'll be useful to other people running other studies if they want to try using Spotify in a similar way for different things. So yeah, I definitely think so. Be interesting.
And then Leo says, I wonder if the white noise and rain noise energy was referring to its signal energy rather than how subjectively energetic they feel. Do you have plans to look at traditional sound quality metrics like roughness, etc., over the course of the music?
Yeah, I do. I wonder how that's working. So if you look at the definition of that variable that they provide, it is specifically how energetic they feel the music is in terms of like, would you move around to it and that type of energeticness, which is really interesting. Again, I'm really, really curious how they define that and how they trained something to define that. At the moment, no plans to look at the other types of metrics, partly because it's not my area of expertise, but definitely would be cool to link up with someone who knows a lot more about that to do that kind of analysis. I imagine you'd have to do it on a much smaller sample because what you don't get with Spotify on the API, as far as I know, is like access to the actual tracks to analyze the actual music yourself. You just get their derived features that they've been producing. So probably more in like a closed setting, it would be easier to do that kind of thing, I imagine. But Leo, you might know a lot more about that than I do.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Nina. That was so fascinating. As I said, can't wait to hear the results. We've got one. I think we have time for one more. So Thea says, Tidal, Apple services may be used in a more static setting, also an older or wealthier demographic with a hi-fi setup. Spotify, etc., used by a more younger audience on the move.
Yeah, I suspect that is definitely true. And there's definitely going to be some kind of underlying things about and also what's the other one? Last FM. A lot of people who are very into their music are using Last FM and asked if they could participate with that. So yeah, definitely something in terms of how people use music. Claire, thank you very much. Just found the decibels, the overall loudness definition that they give. So just forward it in the chat for Chris or anyone else who was interested about how they measured that.
Yeah. Lovely. Thanks so much, Nina. Yeah, as I said, fascinating. Will pop up again on the slide. This is how you can best to stay in touch with us of all the different channels. As we probably know, Bristol Data Week is an annual thing. We are using feedback forms for the past however many years to try and improve the Data Week year on year. And we can only do this by hearing from you. You have the chance to actually win a £50 Love to Shop voucher. There will be a link in the chat box. So please fill this out. It should only take five minutes. But yeah, thanks again, Nina, for joining us, and have a great rest of your day and hopefully see you at another one of our Data Week sessions. Thank
Thanks.
you.